Meeting poet Elisabeth Frost in the beginning of our work together was purely accidental. I was approached by a curator who was putting together a group show called the Poetic Dialogue Project. And for this show, she was pairing up 30 visual artists and 30 poets from around the country to make new work that incorporated image and text rather than one illustrating the other. In other words, the idea would be that you would create one piece of work that involved both the poetic text and the imagery. So I had one experience with collaboration with Montreal Dance at Western Washington University, and that was several years before, and I was making detritus for a dance set that you see here, and Beth had no experience with collaboration. So we didn't know one another's work, and we had never met. We had no idea if it would work out or where we would go with it, and we both needed to leave our comfort zones, knowledge bases, work habits, even our expectations in order to collaborate. We like to think of the resulting work as crossing borders among media and forms. The questions that were facing us were both formal and procedural. Neither one of us knew the process or where it would take us.
Of course, there are artists and writers who cross borders and mix media all the time, and the 20th and now 21st centuries are rich with examples. But my training as a scholar has strongly instilled in me the idea that in order to make something, you need to know something about medium, history, methodology. I had no interest in taking up another art form on my own. I wanted to cross over with someone to break the solitude of the writing process. The journey to do that was quite literal. I live in Manhattan, while Dianne lives on tiny Obstruction Island. Our homes couldn't be more different. We'd never met, but we agreed that in order to collaborate, we needed to be together, exchanging ideas, beginning a process of trial and error. Dianne generously asked me to come out and stay, and I gratefully and anxiously accepted. One friend looked up the population of Dianne's island. 12. Actually, that was an overestimate by 400%. And noting that she and I had never even met, my friend asked if I was crazy going out there with no way off the island. "Haven't you seen Psycho?" he asked. Luckily, we hit it off right away, and that was 8 years ago.
Okay, Beth and I are lucky because we benefit from the knowledge each of us has about our separate arts. We teach one another, and our interests overlap. But collaboration is challenging because it implies cooperation and compromise. And those are two qualities that are not taught nor nurtured in either of our professional backgrounds. So Beth arrived at my studio, and we had just the length of the summer to start and finish whatever the work was going to be. And Beth thought we had many months, and it was a jolt to her working process, which she told me often involved years to finish a single poem, whereas in my professional life, I had been responsible for an exhibition every 18 months. We started to discuss what we shared, Beth's interest in serial form and the use of specialized diction in poetry, and my interest in collection and scientific preservation.
Dianne started showing me some of her altered photographs that she'd put aside, images that she liked but had never taken to the next step to create finished work. I fell in love with her series of spider webs. We decided that Dianne's web images, all taken on the island and then abstracted in Photoshop to resemble line drawings, would allow us to play with a number of ideas. We were especially interested in the idea of the web as something extruded from the body, a trace of that body.
Okay, many of the visual devices that we used in our first project, which is called Arachne, and which is on exhibition here, are derived from the conventions of specimen preservation and identification that are employed by scientists. The two pictures on the left are straightforward photographs that I made of preserved marine algae specimens from the herbarium during a residency at the Whiteley Center here at the Friday Harbor Labs. And you can see a collection accession stamp, which is the little square box in the corner, the lower left of the upper image. You can see inked and penciled notes, labels, and tape. On the right is a 64-inch tall diptych that I made by photographing both sides of an actual specimen sheet of preserved seaweed on which the seaweed had been folded over the top of the sheet of the paper and onto the back. And this piece is the basis for our deciding to present Arachne as diptychs representing both sides of sheets of paper with stains and other marks that show through from one side to the other. And I mention that because sometimes when you're looking at work on the wall, some of these little details are overlooked, but you'll actually see some of the show through from the top page to the bottom page and vice versa. Biological collections for scientific study have been the subject of my work for many years, and so we decided to adapt the visual vocabulary of collection and preservation and then create fictional specimen pages for the spider webs.
We hope to create a parallel between the idea of the web as a trace of the body and handwritten notes, which are similar marks that come out of bodies. Eventually, we handwrote and typed the text, and Dianne then scanned it in for use in the piece. Our first piece ended up relying, this one, on found language. I think that may in part have been because I so loved Dianne's drawing that I wanted to let it have the room that it needed. This is one of the benefits of working not just in tandem, but actually together in the same studio. We move perpetually back and forth between drafts, each altering our own portion as we go. Not an independent poem, the text here introduces the idea that Dianne depicts of ballooning, how baby spiderlings spread into a new habitat, each launching itself on a single strand of silk. A note indicates that Darwin observed spiderlings ballooning 60 miles off the coast of South America, a fact that I loved.
The second diptych concerns the web as a highly complex structure. The red text that's singled out in the poem is reproduced on the top panel in all of the pieces except for the first one. We like the idea of using one contrasting color to mark particular words that read together could almost constitute a separate poem. In this case, it reads, "Silk, a tinsel accretion of the body."
This is the most structured text and the most sequential of the pieces that I wrote for Arachne, in keeping with the idea of the rigorous structure of a web. It's a rough take on sonnet form, though not a strict one.
Okay, piece is about the web as a trap for prey. It depicts a spider's sucking stomach. The sucking stomach is what allows spiders to ingest and consume what is caught in the web.
The poem I wrote assumes the voice of the spider, whose methods of capturing prey don't require motion of any kind, no need for chase. I wanted the words to float, allowing for multiple meanings. Here, the red-colored text reads, "Signal line, capture thread, colisari, sucking stomach."
Okay, in this image, there's little figurative content, just paper, stickers, and pieces of tape. The tape and the text carry an equivalent visual weight, which is something I was after in particular. We were intrigued by the idea of conservation of energy. The spider often consumes its own web as food. It's recycling the protein. And what I was after in the top panel was the feeling of web fragments to represent consumption, as well as having these fragments serve almost as a representation of text, a kind of hieroglyph in an unknown alphabet.
The idea that the spider eats its own web fascinated me. Her creative product becomes ephemeral, transformed into the thing that nourishes her. The red text here reads, "Gossamer, perfect, hackled bands, stabilimenta, you, your own survival."
This is the final piece in the series. The image here shows a woman giving birth to a spider with reference to the myth of Arachne. In Greek mythology, Arachne is a weaver who dares to a mortal weaver who dares to try to outshine the gods by making weavings of their infidelities. And as punishment for her arrogance, Athena turns her into a spider who is doomed to weave forever. Arachne then chooses to hang herself. So in this picture, the web becomes not only the female torso that you see on the top, but it's also the umbilical cord and the hanging noose.
This is also the most explicitly feminist portion of the series, something we wanted to be present, but not to overpower the work. I tried to get a balance between narrative and effects of sound in this poem, and the ending describes the hanging of Arachne by her own woven threads, and the language is actually deliberately clotted so that the meanings can multiply.
You're on.
After Arachne, beginning another series proved challenging. We spent a lot of time searching for subject matter that felt compelling to both of us.
The second project that we completed is titled The Lore Which Nature Brings. This is a line from Wordsworth. For the poem that Beth wrote for the frontispiece that you see here, she incorporated the titles and some of the found text that's used in the images that follow in order to tell the story of what the whole piece is about. And I'm going to go ahead and read this poem. This was the business of her life. On one hand, safety, to fly, flee, rove, rest, and on the other, fixed abode, to couple, lay, hatch, clutch after clutch, glean from courtship's flurry the next and next, the nest's sole function being to brood, and brooding breed, and breeding flourish. Every survival the result of sad experience, the cracked, the lost, the faltered, the flown, the captured, the broken, the dead, while each watching moment, extreme caution, might or might not yield its scarce yield, till, probably due to the work of an immature, things fall apart. The lore which nature brings began with a group of photos of bird nests that I had taken on the island. And in late December 2008, I sent Beth this picture along with some others, wondering if it generated any ideas for her.
I had been going through a very difficult period taking care of my mother, who went quite suddenly from self-sufficient to impaired in her late 70s. The nests struck so many notes for me about creation, nurturance, and home. Most of all, I experienced these images as absence. They seemed to suggest the absent body of the mother.
Cultural cliches about nests and nesting threatened to overwhelm the images, but still we were interested in the cliches themselves, especially the presumption of maternal instinct, and that we hoped we might debunk. The anthropomorphic view of birds so common in lyric poetry drew Beth to this material.
During my research at Dianne's studio, I learned of the early 20th century field of kaleology, the collection and preservation of birds' nests. I hadn't realized that nest collection was an activity directed at well-to-do women as a craft or hobby. I found a facsimile of an 1890 book, Lady's Manual of Art, with a lengthy passage on how to collect and preserve nests. Here, the maternal and the scientific were meeting up in the way that we needed them to. But trying to write about all of this left me stumped. I felt silenced by the wealth of poems about birds and birdsong. I decided that instead of tackling the impossible task of being original, I needed the opposite, to embrace the unoriginal. I would mine the poetic tradition, selectively pruning from famous poems in order to create fragments that Dianne could disperse in various ways, on labels, in handwritten scientific notations, or in text on the pages themselves. I thought of myself as plucking out fragments to make something new, maybe even like a bird scavenging to make a nest. Here are some of the examples of my process of pruning. For our piece, Courtship, which you'll see in a moment, the poem on the left is Yeats's The Wild Swans at Cool. For our piece, Things Fall Apart, I chose the poem by Emily Dickinson that's on the right.
There are 8 images in the series. This is the second image. It's titled Kaleology. And the text there, the prune text there reads, "To seek thee did often rove woods and green. Thou wert hope, a love, still for never seen." The business of her life. The diagram represents the placement of a lark's nest relative to wind direction, the vegetation around it, and the directions of interest to the nest. And the quote here is from Blake, and it says, "Sweet joy befall thee."
Here is Courtship with the fragmented Yeats text that you just saw, scattered and repeated all across the page.
Every nest is a breeding nest. The nest has one function only, although culturally it is powerfully associated with maternity and the maternal instinct. It's actually the males of many species who participate or do all of the nest construction. The background text is Beth's, which she made by breaking apart and repeating syllables to reflect the repetitive nature of parenting by both males and females. As birdsong, for example, you could read, "She is teach, eaching, he is checking." Oops.
This is called Safer Without Fixed Abode. It explores a counterintuitive assertion of naturalists. While in Darwinian terms, it's in the interest of the species to propagate, individuals within the species would actually be safer without doing so, without constructing the fixed abode that is the nest itself.
Things fall apart. Okay.
Our title for the whole series, The Lore Which Nature Brings, is a line from Wordsworth's poem, The Tables Turned. This is the same poem that contains the line, "We murder to dissect." Wordsworth condemns the pursuit of knowledge, science itself, preferring the lore which nature brings by way of direct personal experience, not study. He also implicitly condemns the self-conscious act of making art, but then he goes and writes a poem about it. That paradoxical gesture is captured in my favorite piece, this one, Murder to Dissect. Diane's image is an upside-down nest resembling a hemisphere, and the two texts are perfect antitheses. A segment of Byron's translation of a Catullus poem captures the essence of romantic grief and melancholy on the top. "Ye cupids, droop each little head, nor let your wings with joy be spread. My Lesbia's favorite bird is dead, whom dearer than her eyes she loved." By contrast, on the bottom, a note from an early 20th century collector in an ornithology text provides exactly the opposite ethos. The female of the pretty little warbler, hitherto unknown to any naturalist, is here described for the first time. We are indebted to Mr. Titian Peale, who shot it on the 24th of May near Camden, New Jersey, and with his usual kindness and zeal for natural history, communicated it to us for this work.
Okay, this next piece is a standalone work rather than part of a series, and it foreshadows our more recent project about grief. The piece, which is called Bindle, is directly based on my 1995 series of photographs called India Tigers, and there's a book of them here. They're butterflies inside these paper wrappings that can be called bindles. So the bindle refers to the paper enclosure, and often those are used for specimens or evidence. So, of course, a bird as a specimen would not be preserved this way, so in the aspect of that, the piece in that case is just pure metaphor, but the use of the paper, including its shadows, provided a fitting interest for Beth's words.
Bindle is very significant to me as a tribute to my mother, who died in 2008. It was our first foray into the subject of death and grief. Although looking back now, I realize we've always been making work about women, mothers, and mortality. This piece felt like a gift from Dianne to me at a moment when I was struggling with grief. I wrote the text quickly. I didn't want to interfere with Dianne's poignant image, only to suggest the tension between matter and spirit, movement and stillness, in the most minimal way possible. The text is light as air in hand, pulse still.
After Bindle, I worked on a 3-year graphic novel of sorts with another poet. It's titled Madonna Comics. It's here if you're interested. And for this project, I scanned Little Lulu comic book pages, partially erased them, and then used that as a background on which to build. And I allowed some of the Little Lulu text to show through because I wanted to have her voice as down-to-earth commentary on my selection of lyric text from the pre-existing Madonna poems that I was working with. And during this time, Beth also was working, and she wrote a powerful poem about grief and mourning that she titled Gone. We wanted to work together again, and at the time I was immersed in figurative work from working on Madonna comics. So I took the poem Gone and I broke it into 5 segments that I thought could be approached as separate projects. I didn't think that one visual series could encompass all of the ideas and emotions that were contained in the poem. So rather than a picture being worth 1,000 words, I felt like I needed 1,000 pictures. I asked Beth to pose for me so that I could photograph her acting out states of mourning.
I found that process revelatory and very difficult. At the same time that Dianne was being drawn toward the human figure, I was being drawn toward abstraction. I was experimenting with writing that was far more spare than any I had attempted before. In some ways, this was a plus for us. The fragmentary nature of my writing might lend itself easily to being excerpted into phrases that Dianne could work with visually.
Well, I wanted to use these images with selections from the poem that I had a working title for called Divested. And it seems that every time I work with a new poem, I'm also attempting to develop a new way of working, a new style and palette that makes sense with the content and feeling of the poem. And here is a visual idea that I was never able to resolve. The gestures and expressions of the figures are too overstated, and the feeling for me is contrived. So using an existing poem as a starting point was new for us. The poem stands on its own as a separate piece. And so this allowed me the great liberties that I took with selection and juxtaposition of text. In this piece and the other 2 completed ones that we'll show in a moment, we explore divergent means of experiencing and representing the disorienting states that are triggered by loss. The pun in the title of There, capital T in parentheses and then H-E-R-E, draws on a line in the poem about wondering what is here and what is there. I think that the title captures visually the simultaneity of here and there, of this world and the next or its absence, and of 2 people in relation, the dying and the bereaved.
There deliberately disorients the reader, viewer. The she of the poem may be the one dying or the one bereaved. The imagery, both the visual and the verbal images, contrasts a modern clinical experience of institutionalized dying in a hospital, for example, with the iconography of a more metaphysical meditation, using abstract shapes like this to ask what is here and what is there.
So in there, I tried to combine minimal abstract imagery with my interest in figurative imagery. So
we'll read this through. Divested until of what? She misses she. What she reaches. Clutch, clutch, clutch. White coverlet, gray. Tilting, tilted. Moving lips and jaws.
voice, voice, voice. Table surface, its cup of ice, cotton, cold. Gray splotch, white ceiling. Here, she says. Where? Here, she says. What is here? What is there? She left and leaves she. She asks how long she will be gone.
In June of 2014, Dianne and I shared an artist residency to work on our grief project. This was the inaugural year of the Willapa Bay Artist in Residence program, opened near Oysterville by Cindy Hayward. So here we are in Oysterville. And what became House of Stone had part of its origin in this poem that I had been unable to finish and had discarded. It appealed to Dianne as the text for a very different kind of sequence from any that we had tried, and we edited the text together. I had drafted some of it along with the poem Gone a year earlier while at a residency at Hedgebrook, a retreat for women writers on Whidbey. The imagery was similar enough to our environs in Oysterville that the visual and the textual came together.
Here are examples from House of Stone, one of the parts of the Grief Project on top, and what is left but below. My initial attempt for House of Stone was to make conventional, full-range, black and white landscape photos that suggested postcards with handwritten notations. But actually, this project has ended up in a much more formal place instead. So after years of doing studio work, it was a change and a great deal of fun to wander around taking pictures in the natural landscape. My hope was that I could find subject matter that could form the basis for the remaining parts of our grief project. A unique feature of the peninsula landscape are the middens of oyster shells. So photographs of the mounds became the basis for what is left. In that piece, we were after a feeling of desiccation, a weightiness, and lifelessness. This is a cover design for the book of the project, House of Stone. The narrative is fragmentary and open-ended, and again, it concerns the disorientation that stems from grief. But in this piece, there are strong currents of rage and humor, both, that move it forward. The language and the imagery are plain-spoken, even stark. This is the end page and title page. You're nowhere now, all colors dulled. Grief settles in. Ocean behind, ridge ahead, ocean behind. You give up prediction, let the policy lapse. No proposal for next.
You've reached the edge of a continent. In search of permanence, adrift at the rim.
South Beach.
Useless bay. Deception Pass. Desolation Sound.
You're always in your head. Point, no point. You'd like a line to contain you.
Now a sound louder than the surf echoes over the bluff. You want to lose the sound that makes the echo. A dog's bark from the other side. Bluffing.
Wanting to haunt, be haunted. There is no location, no method. There are no rituals available, silly to make one up. Like Bane at the moon. Who does that?
You need to find a plot, your earthly allocation. Each twig, each branch, each stone, yours. In the neighborhood of wishful thinking. To build a house of stone, never empty again. Stone, solid, stone, the sum of it.
Okay, on to what is left. We experimented with various ways of incorporating the text into what is left, and I eventually came up with this vertical sequence, and this is also in the exhibition downstairs. She wakes and she cannot move. She remembers a lap of waves, a cloud layer, gray weight. She remembers gray water, a bucket, end of an open nozzle. She remembers an apartment window, a car window, a hospital window. She remembers wondering what is here and what is there. She remembers costs, adhesions, increments of a lung occluding. She remembers looking straight up. I think these images also work strongly individually. This is She Cannot Move. She remembers wondering and increments.
Two bodies of work emerged from our research at Friday Harbor Labs and residencies that I held at the Whiteley Center there in 2015. We were interested in returning to the scientific language and imagery that we had used in Arachne and the lore which nature brings. It occurred to us that old-fashioned specimen slides with their labels and often handwritten texts might provide a wonderful visual and linguistic template. The series Rose Was All There Was began as a project on the preservation and scientific interpretation of jellyfish embryos. Dianne joined me at FHL and photographed a series of slides in their collection, some dating back as far as the 1950s. But once we looked at the images, We were taken less with the scientific possibilities than with the beautiful effects of time and color on these microscope slides. The aging and cracked glass, the apparent decay of the medium used to preserve the specimens, and the accidents of line and color that result. So in this series, we left behind the original purpose of the artifacts, scientific study, to ask how we experience something as fundamental as light, as transformative as color, as fragile as glass. I wrote a text to be handwritten around the circle. The subject is vision itself. This one reads, I stared to discern left from right, top from bottom, my cardinal points askew, not knowing what I knew, until figure and ground traded places.
These are the little circles of cover glass that hold specimens to the rectangular glass microscope slide. I had the idea of running the text around the outside of the circle rather like jellyfish tendrils. These are jellyfish embryos that we were photographing. Not this one, but this one.
I decided that each piece would begin with the act of looking. I stared. This one reads, I stared within a circle at a circle. I stared until all locations were one terrain, all terrains mine. I stared so long my eye bloomed and wrote a new alphabet of color. I stared at a crystal rhizome, its cut glass aureole, until all flesh receded, until I wore the sky's pendant against my skin. I stared into a bone's marrow, its hollow, as a mind absents itself from all the matter of a big surround, until my eye adjusted. I stared until everything rose, until everything real was rose, until rose was all there was in a yellow field.
In the series For All We Know, there is no text whatsoever. The wordless rectangles are visual abstractions. Initially, I had intended to have Beth create text for these, but after I deleted the identifying text, I found that it was the very absence of that text that made these become meaningful to me. It allowed for a wider-ranging openness to subjective interpretation. In fact, the title of this series became the title of the exhibition, in which, in a sense, in all of the work, we ask what is knowledge and how many ways are there of knowing. This is a straightforward photograph of a microscope slide that has suffered ravages of time. Here, even the specimen no longer exists. And so photographs like this are the basis of the group of work called For All We Know. I completely removed all of the identifying marks. There are 3 pieces in the series that are not on display in the exhibition. This is one of them. Oops.
So
That's it, folks.
that's our talk. Thank you.